Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This, I'm afraid, was very unexpected, but unfortunately David and Sarah couldn't make it, so there are no slides. But I thought it was worthwhile just to give you a little bit of background in relation to the ranching experiences that we've had on Burrishoole and on Delphi, because several people asked me about it yesterday. And just to thank Johannes for his fantastic presentation on the Ranga. I think you'll actually see a lot of linkages between the programs that we have in place on the Burrishoole and on the Delphi, and you'll also see a direct connection between Cottlefjordur that was mentioned earlier and my predecessor at Burrishoole, which is David Piggins. I think it's important to say at the outset, I'm going to deal with Burrishoole first of all, that when we talk about ranching at Burrishoole, we're talking about line-bred ranching. We're not talking about taking fish from a population, rearing them as smolts, and then ranching them out. In 1964, David Piggins started with the idea that really his wild smolts in a research context were so valuable to him that he needed a surrogate. He needs something, some experimental animal that he could tag and that he could release. So with enormous patience in 1964, he took some prime fish from the wild and he started then to tag and release these wild fish, and that was the beginnings of the ranch strain. And between 1964 and 1968, there was some pure wild fish then reintroduced into that particular stock. But that was it. And until the late 80s, when Tom Cross put some additional wild fish in, because there was some fears of inbreeding, which were actually ill-founded, they don't seem to have had a major effect, the wild fish that went in. That is a line-bred stock of fish, and Phil can comment on this. And it is genetically quite distinct from the wild fish at this stage. But it has shown some absolutely extraordinary performance traits in terms of the ability of this line-bred fish to do what it was designed to do, which was to do quite well in terms of hatchery conditions, but do extraordinarily well at sea relative to other ranch strains. And of course, the big advantage is so many fish were coming back, just as Johannes showed us, that in essence then you created a rod fishery without even intending to do so. I was actually with David one afternoon, I wasn't working there at the time, when Arne Isaacson from Iceland was with David and he was planning what was mentioned earlier, which is Cottlefjordur, which was the first experimental ranching station in Iceland. And the Cottlefjordur hatchery was actually based on Burrishoole. It was based on the techniques that David Piggins developed. So it has gone from Burrishoole to Cottlefjordur to the Ranga and equally to Delphi. So it's all coming from the one source, which was David Piggins. In terms of survival rates, my first job as a salmon biologist, I was handed a sound recorder and I was introduced to a colleague that I knew very little of at the time who had a camera. And would you believe I was sent all over the world to actually make a film on salmon ranching. And that's how I got to see Cottlefjordur in operation. And we came back and we suggested that we should seriously consider ocean ranching as a substitute for the drift net fishery at the time. And the reason for that was because David Piggins was pulling down survival rates of 10 to 15% with the ranch stock. And that was to the coast now. That was before the nets took their share. And he was at times getting up to 20%. So these were ranched fish producing 20% off the coast. In terms then of the angling exploitation rate at that stage, the angling exploitation rate at that stage was in the region of 10 to 15%, but it was a loch fishery. And certainly Burrishoole is a strange loch fishery. It's a saltwater lake. We shouldn't be salmon fishing in it at all. It's ridiculously frustrating. But at the same time, it does produce the fish and you see lots of fish jumping, and that's why people fish it. But I'm just making that point to say if this was done in a river, you'd probably get even higher exploitation rates. In terms of the graph that Phil showed earlier, he was actually very kind to me because I must take personal responsibility for almost ruining Burrishoole in terms of my decision. In an effort to try and make money where we were a self-funding research organisation, we decided to triple the amount of smolts that we were actually releasing from the ranch stock in the expectation that it wouldn't have any major effect in terms of the wild stock. So what you saw earlier wasn't a nice, neat scientific experiment. It was something that was driven by a management need. I think that's an important point to make, that very often these decisions are based on a management need rather than a situation where they're based on some sort of sophisticated knowledge in advance that you're going to produce an interesting scientific result. In doing that, though, it was interesting to actually see the response in terms of the angler interest, same as you have on the Ranga, same as you have on Delphi. And This is not often spoken about, but I think it should be mentioned in this gathering, and I think we should actually think about it. The most successful year we ever had was using farmed fish. When Philip was actually doing that big experiment that he showed earlier, where there was the integration between the wild and the farmed, obviously we had to do a set of experiments in freshwater and a set in the marine. So all of the fish, wild fish, farmed fish, all of the crosses were released, they were branded, there were differential returns. But there was one year, particularly the first year, when we had a lot of purebred fannet fish coming back. And the fishing was absolutely, utterly spectacular. And anyone that experienced it will know this. We had loads and loads of fish coming back to us between 12 and 20 pound weight. The biggest fish we got back was 27.5. It was so big, it got caught in the in-scale of the trap actually going upstream and couldn't get its shoulders through. And there was people broke their rods, they lost fishing lines and so on, and it's still talked about in the west of Ireland. It was the most amazing experience in terms of an ability to be able to artificially produce a rod fishery. And I have never forgotten that, because there is something in that in terms of a lesson. Obviously, it has huge risks involved in it, but it was certainly interesting to see the results of that. The other point I want to make is that I shouldn't be talking to you this morning. It should be Deirdre Cotter. And Deirdre's a very quiet lady, but she's the guru. She's the lady who actually produces these very high-quality fish. And there's some very interesting trends starting to come out of the talks in relation to the production of ranched fish for the rod. Unlike Johannes, we only produce one-year-old smolts. The two-year-old smolts were far too prone to furunculosis, and in our case, furunculosis was a very big issue. The fish have to be absolutely fin perfect before they're released out into the ocean. The food ratio is done on a very careful basis, and post-Christmas, the actual diet is reduced. So the amount of protein and fat going into the fish is reduced to do exactly what Johannes mentioned, to make these very slim, very powerful fish. And the additional thing Deirdre does is regulates the flow rates so that the musculature in the fish is built up before release. And that means then that they're like racehorses. They're actually ready to go to sea before they're released. We went through all of these things of the release ponds and trying to time the release ponds and so on. And then eventually Deirdre discovered a very simple way of releasing the smolts. We're in a privileged position where obviously we're monitoring every single salmon smolt that's going out. And at the peak of the smolt run, of the wild smolt run, is when the ranched fish are released. And that has worked extraordinarily well for us. We also found that by far the simplest way of doing it was to pump the fish straight out into the saltwater lake, rather than trickle feeding them. If we trickle feed them out, we have dreadful problems with predators. Whereas if you send them out in one big mass release, even though it appears to actually attract more predators, the time period for them to actually work on the smolts is very limited, a couple of days and they're gone well out. We did some tracking and we know they're out at the back of Achill Island within a matter of 48 hours. So they move out very, very, very fast. So the Delphi story then started with the sea trout stock collapse in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And Peter Mantle at the time was distraught. He had bought this very valuable house and fishery in the west of Ireland. The vision was that it would be run mainly on the basis of high quality sea trout. There was a small stock of wonderful 2C winter fish in the system. And as is the case in Ireland, in several areas, lake systems can actually produce a predominance of these multi-sea winter spring fish. But he had this very small, discrete stock of fish, and he had no real options. He had a few stray grills, and that was about it. So David Piggins and I had a meeting with him, and we suggested to him that he should think about ranching. And his first thought was to take the Burrishoole fish and to ranch them. And we said, we think you would be far better off to actually introduce into Delphi the line-bred Burrishoole fish. So Peter did that. So it was the Burrishoole grills that he put into the system. And as Phil showed earlier, they actually performed better than they did in Burrishoole. So the point that John Gibbs made yesterday in terms of the orientation and the mouth of the rivers and so on, we have a lot to learn about that, but they did really well for him in terms of the grills. But then he did something really innovative, which Peter always does. And in conjunction with a chap called Tom McDermott, who used to be one of my employees and is a biologist, salmon biologist, they started to line breed the multi-sea winter fish. And to be honest, we were quite sceptical about this. We really didn't think this would get very far. And surprise, surprise, he's actually produced a good ranched strain of multi-sea winter fish. And yet, to try and save money and to make it more economic, he wanted rid of the Burrishoole fish, and he started to line breed the Delphi grills. And the Delphi grills have been a bit of a disaster. They're actually thinking about now re-importing Burrishoole grills. But he has the perfect combination now, or Delphi has, where they have the multi-sea winter ranched fish, which are doing quite well. And if they did bring back in then the high-performing ranched grills, it would twin the two, if you like. It's interesting that the system is continuing, I think, because of this mix we talked about yesterday between genetics and environment. It's continuing to produce these lovely multi-sea winter fish, and that's probably what it's best at. In terms of the removal of the fish, this has been an ongoing battle, and I think it's an important point. Certainly, if I was suggesting that anyone even consider ranching, there's only two possibilities. You go and you look for ranching sites, and I have found a few in Ireland. I've found a few rivers in Ireland that have no natural run of fish because of impassable barriers and so on. That would make wonderful sites for ranching. And the second thing is, if you're thinking about ranching at all, in the context of having any native fish in your system, you have to have a trap, which Delphi resisted and have continued to resist. Whereas in Burrishoole, we have a full set of traps. Whereas Phil mentioned, we can actually remove the proportion or all or whatever we decide of the ranched fish, and that's the only way really that you can do it. And the situation on Delphi from an economic point of view, Peter and I did a paper on it some years ago. In contrast to the Ranga, because obviously he can't charge those sort of rates in terms of the fishing, but he can charge very good rates in terms of the accommodation. In the 1990s, the fishery was losing the equivalent of 100,000 Irish pounds. That's what it was costing to run the programme. But it was worth it as a lost leader in comparison to what he was doing in terms of the business he was doing actually in the lodge itself. So the fishing, certainly in Ireland, based on ranched fish, there is absolutely no way it's economic. And certainly at the current return rates, there's absolutely no way it's economic. But perhaps if it's linked in with some other business, it may actually prove to be something that people might consider. The other issue is the whole question of legality and whether it's legal. And certainly in Ireland, it's not legal. And we've had several requests. We had requests from some commercial fishermen some years ago to look at ranching again. And the decision was no, there was too much risk in terms of straying. There was too many unknowns. And really, we're better off because our national policy is very clear. We're managing on the basis of wild fish. We have closed down all our salmon hatcheries. The only salmon hatcheries that exist in Ireland are on the impounded rivers. All other hatcheries were closed as part of the deal in relation to the drift nets. As I say, it's a very clear national policy that we're based around wild fish. From a personal point of view, I must say that, and it's probably the angler in me, but I must say that we're missing a trick in terms of the ranching. I do think that we should be looking at that again and thinking about, particularly in the teeth of climate change and so on, what can we do to try and support and perhaps supplement our rod fisheries, while at the same time being really, really conscious of the potential damage that might be done if there was an accident, if there was introgression, or if there was straying. So that's it.
Thank you, Ken. David, did you...
Thank you very much. Very little I can add to what Ken has said, because Ken, as he pointed out, has been involved in all of this since the very beginning and knows it all backwards. A couple of points I'd just make. The removal of fish at Delphi has, of course, been accepted throughout that was desirable, and they do all they can, short of having a trap, to remove the fish. There is a marked reluctance by the fish to go beyond the hatchery outlet, and that fortunately is a suitable area for netting, and most of the fish are removed after the end of the angling season by netting. Now, some fish are caught upstream of there during the season, that is ranched fish, and but as Ken pointed out regarding the Erif, although fish turn up there, that doesn't mean they necessarily spawn there. And I think that one of the other tricks that is really missing from Burrishoole and Delphi is a real study of what is actually going on with the spawning fish. I wouldn't like to say it's unforgivable, but it's bordering on that here is a ready-made experiment in your own backyard. You have the top geneticists, fish geneticists in Europe working there, and this has not been properly put to bed and sorted out as to what's actually going on. The presentations we've heard today have lots of evidence from North America, Scandinavia, but very little direct information from the Irish situation. And I think that's most unfortunate, and I hope that that will be put right. The other point is that everybody accepts, as I say, that the spawning of these ranched fish is very undesirable. They are deliberately made somewhat different to the natural fish, and spawning with the natural fish is the last thing you want. And I'm still very hopeful that there is some development which can take place which will effectively prevent those fish from spawning, as is indeed the case with rainbow trout throughout most of Europe. So they're the points I'd like to add. Whether or not the economics add up, I don't know. That's a matter for the people proposing it and actually doing it to sort out. And it could be they don't, and this will therefore not take off. But like Ken, I feel there is something we really ought to be looking at here, not just to provide a good fishery, but also as a method of protecting wild fish by giving people something else to take home and kill and eat. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, David. Johannes, do you want to come to the front to answer questions? So we'll just, I'm sure there'll be a lot of people interested in the Ranga. It's a pity we couldn't have had the meeting there combined with a bit of fishing.
Middle of July. Yeah.
Was that an invitation, Johannes, for the next time? Well, I, for one, will take you up on that. Roger, your question.
Johannes, I was fascinated by your presentation, particularly when you alluded to the costs of your rearing program. You said it was £43 per fish, but I was slightly lost on just how you had arrived at that figure. I wondered if you could explain it a little more.
Yeah, I took the income, the average annual income, and then what it costs us to run the system, and then I divided that number, the costing of running the whole system, I divided it with the average catch. Do you understand me? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I got £43. It's very simplified.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Johannes as well. Why were there no salmon?
Sorry?
Why were there no salmon before?
Why were there no salmon before?
Yeah.
We think it's because it's a very cold rivers, and we didn't have good enough spawning grounds before, but they are coming up now because there was so much sand coming from the Hekla volcanic mountain, so the bottom was constantly moving. But it has been clearing the last few years, and there are good gravel grounds now. But we just think that the river is too cold. But we need some scientists to come in and do some work for us.
I just wonder whether you think that in part perhaps the success as well is potentially linked to the climate change and the shift in the predictions that places like Iceland will benefit from perhaps the losses that we're seeing further south in the range, and whether that's, again, scientists, I guess, but yeah. It was an interesting point.
This is something we really need to get on researching in the Rangas.
This is for Johannes as well. So you're imposing artificial selection for multi-year fish, which makes perfect sense. And I'm wondering if you've also thought of imposing disruptive selection on run timing to extend the length of the fishery to maximize the profits and try and get them coming as early and as late as you possibly can.
Yeah, we are taking fish that comes early, in the middle, and in the end. So we have tried to do that, but We don't really know why. The thing is, in the East Rangá, they are releasing the smolts about 3 to 4 weeks later than us in the West Rangá. But it seems like this year and last year we had the runs coming in early, but in years before we had them coming in late. It all seems to be similar, even though we do it in different ways. So we don't know why.
A question here. Yeah. Here first. Yeah.
Hi, another question for the Ranga man. Have you had any experience or problems with disease in your hatchery, or in your ponds, or in the river itself?
Hvað nýrnaveiki? I don't know the English word. Nýrnaveiki. There's something that is a lot in brown trout in Iceland called nýrnaveiki. There's a kidney disease.
Okay.
I don't. Probably, I don't know. I don't know. We have had that, but very lower and lower in the hen fish that we are, because we test all the hen fish that we take for the production. So we have had that a little bit, and then we have had sometimes costia. I don't know the English words for that.
No, costia.
Yeah, it's yeah, that's it.
Your cold water may help you in that regard. The fact that you have a very cold running river.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Also in the hatchery, if we keep it no warmer than about 10 degrees, we're okay with costia.
Okay, the far back.
Since you started selecting for the multi-sea winterfish to go into the hatchery, have you noticed an increase in the multi-sea winter rod catch, and if so, to what extent?
Yeah, we have 3 years ago. They in the East River, they started taking only multi-sea winter, both male and female, and there has been about 5 to 7% increase in return of multi-sea winter in the East River, and we are starting now on
from
the
what
west.
to what?
From about 10% till 15-17%, something like that.
So you're still getting 85% of the fish coming back as one sea winter?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, we have a question here in the front.
Okay, Johannes, has there been any problem with straying? Has anyone reported your fish elsewhere in some of the other more discrete genetic pools of Iceland?
A stray with our fish going elsewhere?
Yeah.
Not much. We mark a lot of fish. We mark 1,000 fish for each pond. So there hasn't been much. Actually, in 2008, there was so much fish. They were to be found in the nearby rivers. Mm-hmm. But since then, very little, hardly any.
Okay, thank you.
A question here. Yeah, okay.
Hello there. I'm intrigued when you were showing the photographs on how you keep rod-caught fish in cages and then you transport them to the hatchery on a weekly basis. You certainly couldn't do that in Scotland because, you know, your poaching fraternity would have a great time. So could you please tell us what's happening to them? Is there no poaching problems?
We have had very little of that. One time we got, 1 or 2 times, that's it. It's not a problem in Iceland.
Well, the additional problem is that we used to keep our brood stock in a similar thing, but not in cages. You know, they're big tanks, and they used to fight amongst each other. Do you have a problem with that?
No.
Okay.
We keep them in very big tanks in the hatchery, and they are very peaceful there and no
Okay,
problems.
thank you.
Johannes, do you have any information on how the catches of trout and char have changed over the period of the increase in the salmon returns?
That has definitely gone down. And the main reason is the rangaus weren't fished much before. Very few rods were fishing the rangaus before. But with this increased fishing now, every rod is used every day of the season. So a lot of the trout just has been killed. That's why we want to change the policy, and we are going to ask fishermen to release all trout. I think that is the main reason why there is less trout. There is still char and Arctic char, brown trout and sea trout, but definitely less. We are catching about 100 trout a year now, and maybe 20 char. So it's a lot less, but I think it's due to it has been overfished. But I don't know, there has to be some research done on that.
Okay, one more question, and then we'll move on to our next speaker, and we'll be on time.
Have you, after your smolts have gone to sea, have you any indication as to how far they travel? Has any studies been done to see how far they travel to the leave Icelandic waters?
Yeah, they from the Veiðimálastofnun, they did some research, and they found out a lot of them go only a few hundred miles out on the Reykjanes Peninsula, so it's not too far from the south coast that they seem to go. But we have, it has only a few fish have been radio tagged and followed, so I don't know how clear of a picture that gives, but they didn't go very far.
And just the second part of a question. Before, when you first started this program, were the failures at your when you first started with the trapping your smolts into your cages? Did you have failures? Did you have years of failures, or was it instant success?
Instant success.
Amazing.